Picture the scene. It's early 1800s. You're about to enter the factory, till the fields, or head down to the mine. You have a long day of work ahead of you. A very long day, 12 or 14 hours. And that's not all. Let's say you're heading into one of those new factories, springing up across the country. You'll be spending those long hours in hot, dark and dusty conditions, working in spaces with little to no ventilation. As such, you stand a good chance of getting injured or contracting respiratory diseases like tuberculosis. Life expectancy for a labourer in London is just 22 years old. In 1845, the working population of Manchester was described by Friedrich Engels as like an army just returned from a campaign, broken and exhausted. Workers had deformities, stunted growth and missing limbs. Lots of things had to change. Workers needed safer working conditions, better housing and sanitation, access to cheaper, nutritious food, and perhaps above all else, shorter working hours. This is the story of how the 8-hour day movement emerged and how working hours came to be regulated in the UK. The call for a shorter working day has a long history, with Thomas More's Utopia in 1516 speaking of an ideal society in which workers were not wearied from early in the morning to late in the evening, with continual work like labouring and toiling beasts. This sentiment was echoed by the early trade unionist Robert Owen in 1817 when he wrote that 8 hours daily labour is enough for any human being, with the worker entitled to devote the remainder to education, recreation and sleep. This gave birth to the slogan 8 hours labour, 8 hours recreation, 8 hours rest, which inspired a movement. This aim was later endorsed by the First International in 1864 and the Trades Union Congress in the 1880s. The support of the latter was the result of the tireless efforts of new unionists like Tom Mann and his 8-Hour League. In 1889, East London gas workers went on strike for the 8-hour day after their employers had sought to increase this from 12 to 18 hours, and they won. But securing the 8-hour day, fight by fight, factory by factory, or mine by mine, would only get workers so far. The following year, over 200,000 workers took part in London's May Day demonstration, marching behind a banner calling for the 8-hour day to be made law.
Of course, this call was met with stubborn resistance from many employers and their supporters in Parliament. At an 1834 parliamentary inquiry, textile manufacturers insisted that a 12-hour workday was essential for them to see a return on their investment. Parliamentary support for regulating working hours was therefore piecemeal, sector-based, and at first focused on women and children. For example, the Factory Act 1833 limited the working day for children aged 9 to 13 to 8 hours and for 14 to 18-year-olds to 12 hours. In 1844, this was reduced to 6.5 hours for 8 to 13-year-olds, with girls over 13 and women having their working hours capped at 12 hours. Soon after, men working in textile mills saw their working hours capped to 12 in 1850 and 10 in 1874. Boys under 10 working in the mines also had their hours capped at 10 in 1872. However, more forward-thinking employers, like Mather and Platt, began to show in the 1880s that reducing working hours could actually increase productivity. In 1889, Mark Beaufoy introduced the 8-hour day in his vinegar and jam factory and reported that his employees worked more willingly, more intensively, without rest periods, and with the greatest punctuality. Similarly, in 1906, a Board of Trade departmental committee reported that shorter working hours for mine workers would encourage more into the sector. 2 years later, the Coal Mines Regulation Act reduced the miners' working day to 8 hours. However, this failed to include winding out time, meaning in practice working 9 to 10 hours.
The 8-hour day did not become the norm in workplaces across Britain until after the Second World War, and it was not until 1998 that a national universal maximum number of working hours was introduced. Even then, however, this came in response to the European Union's 1993 Working Time Directive, and with it, a voluntary opt-out for workers wishing to work longer hours. This is a loophole unscrupulous firms have exploited ever since. As a result, the British work among the longest hours in Europe. This has led to calls for working hours to be reduced. Some looked to Scandinavian experiments with a 6-hour working day, which recorded an increase in productivity and worker motivation. Others have called for a 4-day working week. Meanwhile, changing patterns of work, the expansion of the gig economy, and the rise of working from home, accelerated by the COVID pandemic, have also blurred the lines between when work starts and finishes. For all these reasons and more, the call for an 8-hour day feels as relevant today as it did over 2 centuries ago.